For nearly a week, Officer Darius Jones had watched the same small boy walk alone through the streets of Oakland, following almost the exact same route every afternoon with a worn backpack hanging over one shoulder and a seriousness on his face that seemed completely out of place for someone so young. At first, Darius assumed there was nothing unusual about it. Children walked to stores all the time, especially in neighborhoods where families knew one another and everyone seemed to recognize the familiar faces passing their windows. But something about this boy slowly began bothering him. He never stopped to play. He never wandered. He never bought candy, soda, or anything a child his age might normally spend a few dollars on. Instead, he entered the same convenience store, disappeared inside for several minutes, and came back out clutching his backpack tightly against his chest before continuing toward the older part of the neighborhood. Day after day, the routine repeated exactly the same way, until Darius finally decided that curiosity wasn't enough anymore. He needed to know what this boy was carrying, where he was going, and why a child who looked barely old enough to be trusted alone seemed to be living according to a schedule more disciplined than most adults. What Darius discovered would lead him into a house filled with fear, a family hiding far more than poverty, and a secret that would eventually force him to question how much suffering could exist behind a front door everyone else simply walked past. Officer Darius Jones had spent years working patrol for the Oakland Police Department, long enough to learn that the smallest details sometimes mattered more than the obvious ones. A broken window could mean nothing, or it could mean someone was afraid to report what had happened inside. A child walking alone could be perfectly normal, or it could be the first visible sign of a situation nobody else had noticed. Darius had developed a habit of observing people carefully, especially children, because children rarely knew how to hide fear as well as adults did. And this particular boy had something in his expression Darius couldn't ignore. He looked tired. Not the ordinary kind of tired that came from school or playing too late, but the exhausted look of someone carrying responsibilities he didn't understand how to put down. So, one afternoon, Darius parked his cruiser several buildings away from the convenience store and waited. The boy appeared almost exactly when Darius expected. Small frame, backpack, head lowered. He crossed the street carefully, glanced behind him once, then pushed open the store door. Darius followed several moments later, keeping enough distance that the boy wouldn't feel watched. He moved between the aisles, pretending to examine shelves while quietly tracking the child's movements. The boy ignored snacks, drinks, toys, and everything else surrounding him. Instead, he walked directly toward the baby care section. Darius slowed. The boy stood in front of the shelves for several seconds, carefully comparing prices as though every cent mattered. Then he picked up a package of diapers. Darius stared. Diapers? The boy couldn't have been more than 8. He watched him carry the package toward the counter, reach into his pocket, and count a small collection of bills and coins. There was nothing playful about the purchase. The boy seemed almost anxious, repeatedly looking toward the entrance while the cashier placed the diapers into a bag. The moment he left, Darius approached the cashier. "That kid," he said quietly. "Does he come here often?" The woman gave him a concerned look. "Every day." "Every day?" "Same time, same diapers. Sometimes he barely has enough money." She hesitated before adding something that immediately made Darius more uncomfortable. "I've asked if he's okay. He never really answers." That was enough. Darius stepped outside and saw the boy already halfway down the sidewalk. Instead of confronting him, he decided to follow. He maintained a careful distance as the boy moved through several quieter streets, leaving behind the busier part of the neighborhood and continuing toward an area where houses became older and less maintained. The boy walked quickly, gripping the bag of diapers against his chest as though he were afraid someone might take it from him. He looked over his shoulder more than once, and every time he did, Darius stepped behind a parked vehicle or slowed his pace. Finally, the boy stopped in front of a tired-looking house near the outskirts of the neighborhood. The yard was neglected, paint peeled from sections of the exterior. The curtains remained mostly closed despite the daylight. Before entering, the boy looked up and down the street. Then he disappeared inside. Darius remained where he was for a moment, studying the house. Something felt wrong. Not necessarily dangerous, at least not yet, but wrong enough that walking away didn't feel like an option. He approached the front door and knocked. Several seconds passed. Then the door opened slightly. A woman in her late 30s stood behind it, her face pale with exhaustion. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, and her eyes carried the hollow expression of someone who hadn't slept properly in a long time. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Darius Jones," he said calmly. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I've noticed a young boy coming here every day, and I'm concerned about him." The woman's expression changed instantly. Not anger, fear. Darius noticed it immediately. He explained that he had seen the boy buying diapers each day and simply wanted to make sure everything was all right. For several seconds, the woman seemed unsure whether to close the door or let him inside. Eventually, she stepped back. "My name is Emily," she said quietly. The living room told Darius more than she probably intended. There was very little furniture, almost nothing decorative, and several areas of the house looked unfinished or neglected. But despite the obvious financial hardship, the place wasn't dirty in the way Darius had expected. It looked more like a home where someone was desperately trying to maintain control while everything around them slowly slipped away. Emily apologized for the condition of the house and sat down. Then she began talking. She had lost her job months earlier. Bills had accumulated quickly. She was raising her children alone, and after the birth of her youngest child, she had fallen into severe postpartum depression that made even simple daily tasks feel overwhelming. Her 8-year-old son, Daniel, the boy Darius had been following, had slowly started taking on responsibilities no child his age should have carried. He cleaned, helped prepare simple meals, watched his younger sibling, and walked to the store whenever something was urgently needed. Darius listened without interrupting. Part of him felt enormous sympathy. Another part kept telling him that Emily wasn't saying everything. Daniel entered the room carrying a cup of coffee with both hands. "This is for you," he told Darius politely. Darius smiled. "Thanks, buddy. You didn't have to do that." The boy smiled back, but it disappeared the moment Darius asked the question that had brought him there. "I see you walking to the shop every day. Are you okay?" Daniel froze. His fingers tightened around the edge of his shirt. Darius leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "You can tell me anything. You're not in trouble." Daniel looked toward his mother, then toward the front door, then back to Darius. "I have to help Mommy," he whispered. "I understand," Darius said, "but why do you look scared?" Daniel swallowed. "I have to, or else." "Or else what?" Emily interrupted immediately. "He's tired, officer. That's all." Her voice came too quickly. Darius looked at her. The same fear he had seen in Daniel was suddenly visible in her eyes. Emily stood and forced a weak smile. "Is there anything else?" Darius understood the message. He rose, thanked her for speaking with him, and walked toward the door without pushing further. He had learned long ago that forcing frightened people to talk before they felt safe could make them shut down completely. Outside, he walked back toward his cruiser. As he reached the driver's door, movement behind one of the curtains caught his attention. The curtain shifted slightly. Daniel's face appeared behind the glass. The little boy stared directly at the police car. Tears were running down his cheeks. Darius felt something tighten in his stomach. That wasn't embarrassment. That wasn't simply poverty. That was fear. And as he started the engine, he suddenly had the uncomfortable feeling that Daniel wasn't the only person watching him leave. Someone else was involved. Someone who had enough control over that house to frighten both mother and son into silence. Darius pulled away from the curb, drove only a few streets away, then stopped and reached for his radio. He called dispatch and asked for every report connected to that address and the surrounding block. Break-ins, drug complaints, gang activity, assaults, anything unusual. He expected perhaps a handful of incidents. Instead, when the records began coming back, Darius realized he had just stepped into something much darker than a boy buying diapers. And the house at the center of it all already had a history police officers knew far too well. The records waiting for Darius at the station made the situation far more disturbing than he had imagined. Emily's house had appeared repeatedly in old police reports stretching back years, long before she and her children ever lived there. Drug activity, violent confrontations, suspicious visitors, break-ins, and other serious incidents had all been connected to the property or the streets immediately surrounding it. Darius studied maps of the neighborhood and quickly understood why criminals might find the location useful. The house sat far enough from the main road to avoid casual attention, yet its position offered a clear view of anyone approaching. Suddenly, Daniel's frightened glances toward the windows made much more sense. Darius couldn't prove what was happening yet, but his instincts told him Emily and her children weren't simply struggling financially. Someone was keeping them afraid. The following morning, Darius returned to the store expecting Daniel to appear at his usual time. He never came. The cashier immediately noticed Darius's concern. "He wasn't here today," she said, "but someone else came." Darius stopped. "Who?" "A big guy. Never seen him before. Strange thing is, he bought the exact same diapers Daniel always buys." Within seconds, Darius was back inside his cruiser. When he reached Emily's house, he found her and Daniel inside, both unusually quiet. He had barely begun asking questions when the front door suddenly opened and a large man walked into the room as though he owned the place. Emily's face changed instantly. Daniel moved closer to his mother, and Darius finally understood. The man stared at the police uniform, then at Daniel. "What are you doing here?" "I'm checking on this family," Darius replied calmly. The stranger stepped closer. "They don't need checking on." Darius kept his voice controlled, but every instinct told him this man was dangerous. Before the confrontation could escalate, Officer Hernandez, who had followed nearby as backup, entered the house. The stranger's confidence immediately weakened. With 2 officers present, he stopped moving forward and insisted he was merely a friend helping Emily through difficult circumstances. Darius didn't believe a word of it, but without enough evidence to act immediately, the officers eventually left. The next morning, Darius returned alone. He knocked several times before Emily finally opened the door. There were tears on her face, and this time she stopped pretending. "He's a local gang boss," she whispered once Darius was inside. "He demands money from us. If I can't pay, he hurts me." Daniel stood nearby holding his baby sister. Everything finally connected. Emily had lost her job and was barely keeping the family fed, yet someone was still demanding money from her. Daniel had watched his mother struggle until, at only 8 years old, he began sacrificing his own childhood to help keep the household functioning. Then Darius asked about the diapers. Emily looked toward the baby in Daniel's arms. Her youngest daughter, Lily, had a medical condition that meant the family needed a constant supply. Emily couldn't afford large packages, so she bought only what they could manage each day. When she became too overwhelmed or frightened to leave the house, Daniel made the trip himself. That was what he had meant when he said he had to help Mommy. But there was something else. "Why isn't Daniel in school?" Darius asked. Emily lowered her eyes. "I can't afford everything. Transportation, books, food has to come first." Darius looked at the boy and felt his heart sink. Daniel wasn't skipping school because he didn't care. He was missing school because he had quietly become one of the adults in his own home. Darius decided the family needed more than a police report. He contacted social services, local charities, and community organizations, searching for assistance that could help Emily stabilize the household without separating the family unnecessarily. Neighbors who learned what had been happening began contributing food, clothing, baby supplies, and money. People who had spent years frightened of criminal activity in the area started cooperating with police, providing information they had previously been too afraid to share. Meanwhile, Darius continued investigating the man who had threatened Emily. One frightened family story led to another, then another. Investigators discovered a wider network exploiting vulnerable residents, demanding money, and using intimidation to keep people silent. As evidence accumulated, the same neighborhood that had once been afraid to speak gradually began helping officers build the case. Months later, police finally moved in. The people responsible for terrorizing families like Emily's were arrested, and for the first time in years, many residents felt they could breathe without constantly looking over their shoulders. For Emily, rebuilding took longer. She began receiving professional support for her depression and eventually found work. Lily's needs were properly addressed, donations helped stabilize the family, and slowly their home began feeling like a home again instead of a place everyone was afraid to leave.